Hi there! In this series of videos, we're going to be talking about domestic violence and resiliency. We'll review some of the impacts of growing up in an environment with domestic violence, and we'll talk about how people can build resiliency in their lives. Let's go ahead and start by introducing ourselves. Our agency is called Safe Passage, and we're a violence prevention agency, working with anyone dealing with domestic violence, dating abuse, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking, including people who've directly experienced these things, as well as people who might know or love someone who's experienced this, and doing as much as we can to keep these things from happening in the first place. We work with anyone of any age and any gender, and we serve Idaho's 5 northern counties. Listed here are a few of the services that we offer to our community. To learn more about what we do specifically, and more about these services and how we help survivors in North Idaho, go ahead and watch the video that's linked here, then that describes each of these services in more depth. Now let's go ahead and get into our discussion. So that we're all on the same page, let's go ahead and start with a brief introduction into what domestic violence is. The definition that we'll be using for domestic violence today is any pattern of abusive behaviors that one person in a relationship is using to try to gain or maintain power and control over their spouse or intimate partner. Intimate partner could include everything from a spouse to a dating partner to maybe an ex or a co-parent or another similar or related relationship. Domestic violence can look like a lot of different types of things. It's not just physical. It can include emotional abuse, economic or financial abuse, and sexual violence. And it can also include things like intimidation and isolation or coercion or manipulation. So it can look like a lot of different types of things. For more information about domestic violence and the cycle that it can follow, go ahead and watch the linked series of videos that describes domestic violence and the cycle of abuse. So we also want to know who experiences domestic violence and who is impacted by it. So let's look at a couple of facts. We know that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced sexual assault, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. 48% of women and 48% of men have experienced psychological abuse by an intimate partner. We also know that intimate partner violence or domestic violence accounts for 15% of violent crime that happens. Are any of these statistics surprising to you, or do any stand out? We know that domestic violence is a major issue, and it happens to anyone of any gender, and it can have very serious or even violent effects. So we know that domestic violence can have significant effects, both on the person experiencing the abuse, as well as other people in their life, like their family. We know that 1 in 15 children are exposed to domestic violence or intimate partner violence each year. When I say exposed, I mean somebody might be hearing threats or fighting happening. They might be observing the aftermath or the effects of abuse, or they might be directly seeing that abuse happen. We call that being an eyewitness when they directly see it happening. So we know that 90% of children who are exposed at all, whether hearing, observing, or seeing directly, are eyewitnesses. So 90% of them have directly seen that abuse happen. 90% of that 1 in 15. If someone has directly experienced abuse, we can refer to that as them being the primary victim. If someone has been exposed to abuse but didn't experience it directly themselves, we can refer to that as being the secondary victim. The secondary victim might be the primary victim's child, their friend, or another family member, or maybe just someone else who knows or loves that person. So we know that abuse in a family happens often and can lead to violent crime. We know that abuse of any form takes place in 25% of families. 2/3 of all homicides are connected to domestic and family issues. The number of domestic assaults that happened on women and children between the years 2010 and 2015, that number increased by 20%. And we also know that 40% of all violent crimes that happen are committed in families. So in a minute, we're going to have you go ahead and click the link to watch this video called Will's Story. But before you do that, we just want to warn you that this is a very emotional video, and it talks directly and openly about domestic violence and its connection to death. So we completely understand if you feel like you need or want to skip it. If you do choose to watch the video, please take care of yourself in whatever ways that work well for you. This can be a difficult video to watch, so make sure you're taking care of yourself. So whether you chose to watch Will's story or not, think about this. How might being exposed to domestic violence at home affect the way that a child or young person develops or grows up? We know that exposure to domestic violence can actually change the way that a child's brain develops. Sometimes a child might develop certain unique behaviors that their brain is using to try to keep itself safe. We also know that children and young people who are exposed to domestic violence can often show some of these effects at even higher rates than those who directly experience abuse. So let's go ahead and take a look at what some of those effects are. Physical effects can include anything that happens to or within the child's body, as well as physical harm that they might experience as a result of that exposure. So it might include things like illnesses, stomach aches, headaches, or different pains on their body. It could also include dysregulated eating or sleeping patterns, or maybe dramatic shifts in their eating and sleeping patterns over shorter periods of time. It can include things like self-harm, suicide, or injuries as well. Emotional effects can include any emotional or psychological difficulties that that child might experience as a result of that exposure. Some of these feelings can be confusing for the child and cause greater distress, which can then cause greater emotional feelings, and then that can cause more distress as it becomes more confusing, and it can kind of be a difficult cycle. Some of these emotions might include things like fears or night terrors, feelings of isolation or loneliness, feelings of numbness or just feeling like very little emotion at all, feeling really low self-esteem or maybe guilt or shame or embarrassment, or taking a lot of blame onto themselves and feeling like maybe they are at fault. It can also include kind of placing some of those emotions into anger that can be directed either at the partner who is doing the abusive or harmful behaviors or at the person who might be experiencing that abuse. Behavioral effects can include coping mechanisms or other behavioral tendencies that the child might display as a result of that abuse. Often these behaviors are considered negative in classrooms or in society, especially when people don't understand the reasons for those behaviors. So they can include things like being more irritable or angry, having an increased aggression, maybe being more reactive to things that might happen or reacting very strongly. It could include feeling very powerless, having thoughts that are very intrusive, or a lot of worry or feelings of anxiousness. It can also cause difficulty in concentrating or trouble in learning. Maybe it might impact their grades or their ability to complete schoolwork. They might experience anxiety or depression. They might have a higher likelihood of getting distracted or need a higher level of activity to keep them focused as well. They might also experience a higher tolerance for violence or feelings of withdrawal or apathy, or kind of withdrawing from things that maybe were interesting to them or that they were very passionate about at one point, but kind of pulling away from those things. Often, the constant stress of a situation like this can cause their normal coping mechanisms to maybe not work as well. And so that might mean that they resort to maybe more harmful or dangerous coping mechanisms like substance dependency or other types of risky behaviors. So these effects can look very overwhelming and sad, but thankfully we know that that is not the end of the story. We're going to go ahead and pause here, and when we come back, we're going to look at the second part, and we're going to be looking at resiliency and what we can do moving forward and how we can keep ourselves resilient and how we can keep those in our lives resilient. So go ahead and stop here, and then when we come back, we're going to discuss resiliency and what we can do.